Malfoy, Draco Malfoy, by Talipatra from fanfiction.net. Chapter 2. Emma! I frowned. Who was shaking me awake, and why was he calling me Emma? Emma, wake up. We've got to change trains now. Okay, seriously, who the hell was Emma? I opened my eyes, ready to tell off whoever was shaking me awake, when my eyes locked onto a pair of serious gray-blue eyes. I blinked, and it all came flooding back. Draco Malfoy had dragged me into some kind of bizarre cross-globe flight. I sat up and yawned. Where are we? Berlin. We have to change trains now. I nodded and stood up, grimacing. I was stiff and sore from sleeping on the wooden bench. I was amazed I'd slept deeply enough to necessitate shaking me awake. Draco, damn him, looked as though he'd had a full night's sleep on a feather bed. I scowled at him as we departed the train and made our way across the station. He walked quickly, and I had to trot to keep up. My stomach growled loudly as we passed a food vendor. Malfoy stopped abruptly, and I ran into his back. I looked up at him, annoyed. Go get us something to eat, he muttered, shoving a couple of euros at me. Enough for a couple of meals. I nodded and headed towards the vendor. I smiled at the woman and bought some bread, cheese, and sausages, along with a couple of bottles of water. She wrapped it up in a huge parcel for me, adding in 2 sweet buns for free, and a toothless grin. I smiled back and headed off to find Malfoy. It was easy to spot his platinum blonde hair above the crowd. He was making his way toward me with the bag in one hand and tickets in the other. He linked his arms in mine as we strolled towards a small area that was a little less crowded. I sat on a window seat, and he sat next to me holding up the bag. Disguises. Like glasses and a rubber nose? I asked, curious what exactly he found in a train station. He grinned, the first time since last night. No, they might have put a bulletin to the authorities along the line. I'm too distinctive with this hair, and, your hair is fairly distinctive as I recall. My hands instinctively went to my head. What's wrong with my hair? I demanded. It's out of control. It is not, I said defensively. I've learned to take care of it quite well, thank you. He sighed. Well, the easiest thing we can do is dye our hair. I stared at him in horror. I loved the color of my hair. It was a rich chestnut that witches and muggles alike would kill for. He rolled his eyes. I'm not terribly fond of the idea either, Emma, but it's the simplest way to change our appearances. I scowled at the floor. He had a point. All right, when and where? We've got a 4-hour wait until our train leaves. I know of a hostel near here where we can do it. I nodded. Well, what colors did you get us? Red for you, black for me. Red? He shook his head and stood up, pulling on the stocking cap and offering me a hand. Do you ever stop asking questions? No. He grinned in spite of himself as we strolled out of the station like a honeymooning couple out to see the sights. He clasped my hand in his, lacing his fingers through mine. It was strange how well they fit together. We need to get you a ring, he said absent-mindedly as we stopped in front of a small store and pretended to look interested at the display. I didn't know why we were going through this pretense, but Malfoy was in charge here, as irritating as that was. Why do I need a ring? You're supposed to be a newlywed. Well, then you need a ring too. He sighed. You're right. He checked his wrists, and I was surprised to see he wore a muggle wristwatch. We need to get our hair dyed first, then we'll focus on the rings. I nodded, and we started towards the street again. It didn't take long to get to the hostel, and I was relieved to see it was somewhat decent looking. I've heard horror stories, and of course I'd seen Muggle films. Introducing Ron to Muggle cinema had almost become a regret, as he insisted on seeing nearly every film released. Living in London, there were lots of films released on a monthly basis. I leaned against Malfoy, playing the part of the doting newlywed while gazing up at him adoringly, while he pulled out his wallet and paid for a room with a private bath. The receptionist winked at us, and we disappeared up the stairs. As soon as we were out of sight of her, I moved away from him, letting him lead his way up the stairs. They were narrow and somewhat dark, but I actually preferred them to the lift, and appreciated the fact that Malfoy seemed to recognize this. Our room was small, with a double bed shoved in one corner with a narrow window over the head of it. There was a small dresser at the foot of it, and a few pegs on the wall between the door to the room and the second door, which I could only assume was the bathroom. I poked my head in and sighed. It was absolutely tiny. I wasn't sure exactly how we'd be able to color our hair in here. "Do you need to use it?" asked Malfoy as he dropped his bags and coat onto the bed. I nodded. "You?" "Ladies first." He yawned and took my bag and food from me. "I'll start spreading out food while you tend to yourself." I nodded and shrugged out of my coat, dropping it on the bed next to him. I stepped into the bathroom, stepping into the small shower stall in order to close the door behind me. I quickly relieved myself and washed up, stepping out into the room to eat. My stomach growled loudly, making Malfoy smile again as I sat down next to him. "Shut it, I haven't eaten in days." He raised his eyebrows. "Really?" "Well, not a proper meal anyhow. I was in charge of the entire ball last night. It's been incredibly hectic time, and these past few days I haven't slept or eaten much." "That can't be healthy." I shrugged and took a bite of the bread he'd cut with a knife he'd produced from his bag. "How does the weasel feel about you being out here?" he asked curiously. "His name is Ron Weasley," I said testily, "and I'm not discussing my relationship with you." He shrugged and took a bit of cheese. We ate in silence for a few minutes, drinking our water. Finally, he sighed and leaned over, reaching for the bag with the hair dye in it. His sweater rolled up, exposing a stretch of pale skin and a blonde strip of hair going from his navel down to disappear into his pants. I tore my eyes away and busied myself with cleaning up the food wrappings. I wrapped up the leftovers and tucked them back into the plastic bag before handing them to Malfoy to put in the bottomless bag. He tossed me a cardboard box with a picture of a laughing woman on it with vibrant red hair on the box. I raised my eyebrows at it. "Auburn Flash?" He grinned. "Red for Gryffindor." I rolled my eyes and opened it, tipping it into my hand to read the instructions. I studied it for a second before nodding. "This has to sit for 20 minutes. He nodded. "We both will. I think it'll be easier if we take turns." I nodded and stood back up. "Do you want to go first, James?" He chuckled. "Yes, then we can do yours, and you can sit while I run to get rings." I nodded. "I would suggest taking your sweater off so you won't get dye all over it when you remove to rinse it later." He quirked his eyebrows at me. "You just want to see me half naked, don't you, Emma?" I narrowed my eyes at him. "Hardly." He chuckled and pulled his sweater over his head, dropping it onto the bed next to me. I stood up and grabbed the box from him, opening the mixing dye and the developer, handing it to him to shake while I pulled out the gloves. "You have very nice hair," I commented as I started to muss it slightly so I could get to all of it. "Thank you." I took the bottle of hair dye from him and started to carefully work it into his hair. It really was beautiful hair. I almost hated to cover it up with the deep black. I worked quickly and quietly, massaging his hair and scalp with my fingers in an effort to get the dye in thoroughly. I stopped back to survey my work and nodded confidently. "Looks good." He had a strange look on his face. "Thanks. Want me to go ahead and get yours going?" I nodded. "Might as well. It'll probably take 20 minutes. You got 2 boxes for me, right?" He chuckled and nodded. I hesitated for a moment before pulling my sweater off and dropping it on the bed next to his. I was wearing a strapless bra and felt incredibly exposed. No one but Ron had seen me like this in probably 20 years, at least. He didn't say anything about the red flush that covered my face, neck, and upper chest. We both put our hands up and began pulling the pins out of my hair, letting the long curls fall around my shoulders. It took a while before everything was out, and then he carefully began adding the dye. I was eye level with his chest and stomach, my gaze fixed on his navel against my will. It was an ordinary belly button by any standards, but something about it held my attention. I watched as the muscles on his stomach stretched and relaxed as he leaned over me, moving around me to get all of my hair. Before long, he used up the first bottle, and we were on to the second. I sincerely hoped that 2 would be enough. "Your bra will be ruined," he said suddenly. "Your hair is touching it." "Oh, I chewed on the lower lip for a moment. "Bring me a towel?" He nodded and disappeared into the bathroom, holding his hands up like doctors on television shows. He returned a moment later with a towel in his teeth. I giggled softly and took it from him, securing it under my arms before reaching behind me and unclasping my bra. It wasn't that I cared about the bra. I just didn't want the dye to ruin his beautiful sweater. I pulled the bra off and draped it beside me, not looking at him. I was sure I was redder now than I'd ever been before. I really hadn't been seen like this by anyone but Ron in over 20 years now. A few minutes later, he was done, piling up my hair on my head and holding it carefully while I put a shower cap over it. He nodded and checked his wrist as he carefully pulled off the plastic gloves. Perfect timing. I'll just pop into the shower now. He disappeared into the bathroom and I sighed, relaxing slightly as I heard the sound of water come on. I stood up and carefully gathered up our trash, throwing away the empty bottles of dye, the wrappers from the food, and the boxes the dye had come in. After a few minutes, the shower kicked off, and I could hear rustling in the bathroom as, presumably, Malfoy dried off and pulled his pants back on. I made sure I was completely covered when I heard him opening the door. He stepped out, and for a brief moment, he looked like Harry. His hair was now jet black and was messy from the shower. He raised his eyebrows at me. Well, smashing. He chuckled and checked his watch. A few more minutes and it'll be your turn. I nodded and shifted on the bed, picking up his sweater and holding it out. He took it and pulled it over his head, running his fingers through his hair afterwards. He settled on the bed next to me and pulled his shoes and socks back on, then grabbed his coat. Want anything while I'm out? Surprise me, I said automatically. He grinned and shoved into his coat. Surprising you? I flushed. You don't have to. I don't know why I said that. He nodded and checked his watch. 5 minutes and then rinse. I nodded and he disappeared out the door. I sat for 5 minutes, staring into space, wondering how I got here. I was desperate to talk to Ginny, but obviously that was going to be out of the question. I sighed and pulled off the pants, draping them over the toilet as I started to run the shower. One thing I absolutely hated was stepping into a wet shower. Ron always let me go first, knowing how a wet shower made my skin crawl. I shook myself slightly before pulling off the shower cap and stepping into the tiny shower stall. The water ran red for a while, looking for all the world like I'd slaughtered some large animal in a tiny stall. Finally, there wasn't nearly as much red going down the drain, and before long, it stopped completely. I sighed with relief, having long run out of hot water. I stepped out and toweled off before wrapping the towel around my hair. I pulled on my underwear and then the pants that were Malfoy's. It felt strange wearing a pair of men's pants, even if they did fit me now. I opened the door and froze. Malfoy was standing in the room, pulling a small box out of his pocket. He froze when he saw me. Emma. I flushed. James. Looks nice. Thanks. I crossed the room quickly and grabbed the sweater, wondering why the hell I hadn't taken it into the bathroom with me. I pulled it on and grabbed some of the bobby pins that had been holding my hair earlier and headed back into the bathroom. I worked quickly, efficiently, pinning my hair back and out of my face. I'd have let it down once we were back on the train so that it could dry without making me sick. But once it was pinned up, I returned to the bedroom. Malfoy had straightened up everything else and was holding out a box. My ring. I took it without emotion, opening the box and slipping the single gold band onto my left hand. He was wearing one too. We wordlessly started for the door as I pulled on my coat and Malfoy slung his bag over his head. I scanned the room quickly, out of habit, confident that we hadn't missed anything as we headed downstairs. We could hear loud, angry voices shouting in German at the receptionist as we neared the bottom floor. Malfoy had held out his arm, stopping me short and placing a finger on his lips. He didn't have to tell me twice. I listened intently. I couldn't make out anything they were saying, but obviously they were looking for us. A tall blonde man and a short brunette woman. I felt waves of panic churning in my stomach. Malfoy looked down at me expectantly. Ready to try our disguises? I swallowed hard. I wasn't ready, but we didn't really have a choice. He stepped down a step to level us and then wrapped his arms around my waist, kissing me soundly so he pushed us through the door, making it look like we almost fell through it. I was so startled by the kiss that I couldn't be nervous about walking past the authorities. I had the presence of mind to wrap my arms around his neck and laugh with him as we stumbled past the desk and out into the cold sunshine. Malfoy pushed outside, pulling me against him fully and kissing me deeply. I hesitated at first, thinking of Ron, before kissing him back as though my life depended on it. And ironically, it did. The Germans were watching us. Malfoy's hand slid down my waist and into the coat as he started to walk me backward slowly away from the hostel. I had no idea if newlyweds were actually this affectionate in public, but he wasn't really giving me a chance to question it. He released me and smiled down at me, looking, even to me, like a man in love. I smiled back automatically at him, and he stepped to the side of me, his arms slipping around my waist as we walked towards the train station. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I honestly wasn't sure if it was from the heat and passion of the fake kiss, or from the anxiety of being so near people who potentially wanted us dead. We climbed aboard, and Malfoy pulled us into a small sleeper compartment with a bench seat that folded into a bed. We'd be on the train for nearly 9 hours this time, all the way to Paris. I settled on the bench and looked at him curiously as he put our coats and scarves on the tiny overhead shelf. He settled next to me and leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. "Is everything okay?" I asked quietly. He sighed. "I think so. They're looking for who we used to look like. Apparently they know we aren't really friends, so the friendlier we behave, the less attention we'll get as possible suspects." "James, who are they? Why do they want you? What's going on?" He ran his fingers through his hair again, a very hairy move. "Not here, and not now." "Why not?" He eyed me for a moment. "Well, for one, I'm exhausted. For another, they're going to be checking our tickets in a bit, and I don't want anyone to overhear what I have to say. And finally, I'm not sure how much I can honestly tell you. I'll have to sort that all out in my head first. Fair enough?" "But you will tell me." He chuckled softly. "I don't think you'd let me get a moment's rest if I didn't." "Glad you finally figured that out."